Hi, it's Mike Splash, and I'm going to be doing this webinar this afternoon. The webinar is called Environmental Forensics, Getting It Right the First Time. I just wanted to give you a little bit about my background. I'm a geological engineer as my undergraduate degree, and I did a master's and PhD in earth science from the University of Waterloo a long time ago. I was a professor in geological engineering and environmental engineering at the University of Windsor 15 years before I came to Dragon as the senior hydrogeologist. I've been an expert witness in several states in Canada, started in 1988, and I've done things like landfills, fuel releases, chlorinated releases, and large-scale dairy operations where I used environmental forensics. So just want to make sure that you keep your microphones or telephone muted. That will help to prevent feedback. If you have any questions that you would like answered at the end of the webinar, Alan Hahn is the person you should contact, and his email address is there. And if you have any difficulties with the system, please email Amy Reynolds, and her email address is also there. They're both Canadians and Americans on this webinar, so I freely use Canadian and American spelling and units. So if you need interpretation, let me know. I have lots of material to go over, so I'll probably speak quickly. Besides that, I've had a lot of coffee today, so this should go fairly quickly. And one other thing is I will focus on groundwater. That is my forte. So although we may mention soil, we'll be doing mostly groundwater. So what is environmental forensics? There's lots of different definitions for this, but they're all slightly different, so it's better to describe it with some slides. This is not environmental forensics. The typical groundwater investigation, and the picture you see is my house when I tried to sell it last year, when they discovered a heating oil tank that was huge up against the fireplace chimney that we didn't know about, and we had to get it cleaned up prior to selling the house. So we had a company come in, used the scientific method. They were driven by regulatory and business issues. Regulatory meaning we had to meet cleanup guidelines, business meaning I had to sell my house to buy the other place. So in a typical soil and groundwater investigation, you answer questions such as, what's the problem, how much is there, and where is it? In an environmental forensics investigation, it's a little bit different. You use the scientific method, but you're looking in a different forum. It's either legal, mediation, or negotiation form as opposed to business or regulatory. And you try to answer questions like why, when, and or who. And here you do finger pointing. You try to find somebody who's responsible. Who conducts these investigations? Typically, a soil and groundwater investigation that's not forensics is somebody who's got a bachelor's or master's degree and few to many years' work, like the person on the left who is keen and sharp but hasn't seen much. For a forensic investigation, you usually get like an older person like the guy on the right, that's me, who's seen a lot during the more than 20 years. I've been at it for about 35 years. Typically, this person is PhD, but not necessarily. Although you may not have trouble reading this, this was a recent court decision that it was about 80 pages, and I got a fax copy of it, and I think it describes pretty well what we do in environmental forensics. And I'll just read it slowly. You can read along or just sit back. My preliminary view after hearing the testimony of Dr. Splash was that he undertook his investigation of the property and subsequently his consideration of the data from the property objectively and with an open mind. In particular, he considered from the outset a number of possibilities for the source of the contamination on the property and systematically excluded various potential sources as his investigations intensified and more data became available. Ultimately, after significant investigation and analysis of extensive data, he formed the conclusion with a high degree of certainty. And that's what we like to do in environmental forensics investigation. So I think the judge understood what was going on. I've been teaching a first-year geology course, and I like to take up some time showing some environmental movies like Civil Action and Aaron Brockovich. And if you look at these movies, and I've watched them a lot lately, they make the environmental forensics specialists, the technical people, look kind of foolish in the movies. They're not serious characters, and they don't get John Travolta to play a hydrogeologist. One of the things that we find very important is to get the conceptual site model right. Conceptual site model, or CSM, is what we use to make decisions. The court will make decisions. The regulators would make decisions. Everybody would make decisions based on the conceptual site model, not on what's actually in the subsurface. So you have to develop a conceptual site model that describes what's in the subsurface. And it integrates everything you know about the site, such as site history, hydrogeology, the chemicals, and so on. You can see all the list of things. It has to integrate all that information into an understandable document, which could be like this. It could be a 3D drawing, or it could be a series of cross-sections and maps. But it integrates all the information, and this is what you try to convince people with, or this is what you remediate with. And we'll talk about this particular one later on because it was kind of an interesting conceptual site model. So what has worked for us for more than 25 years is bringing all the tools. So we've got lots of different techniques we can use, and they go together like a jigsaw puzzle. And having these tools allows you to come up with a fairly definitive answer to a problem. But what I find is very important is to get the basics right. You need to have the geology, the groundwater, the site history under interviews and records, groundwater chemistry and chemical behavior right before you add on other things. Fingerprints, to me, and we'll see later on, is something that you add on to the conceptual model to make it more robust, as opposed to the main focus of your conceptual site model. Interpretations go wrong when you find a real-life situation where you never have complete information. So we have to interpolate between limited data, or you fail to integrate information. And I find this is commonly done, and I'll give you examples. So this is a landfill that we worked on when I first started working for Dragon in the 80s. It's a large landfill. There's a lot of boreholes in it, 100 boreholes, but all put together, we only have 175 cubic feet of soil that we looked at compared to 3.5 million cubic feet of landfill. So you have a very small percentage of the material that you're looking at. So you have to integrate what's between. And I mentioned failure to integrate. An example, which we'll go into later on, was a fairly recent and large judgment where there were three experts for the same client on the other side. and these were fingerprinting experts, and they had 3 different opinions on the same material. That's really not, it doesn't really convince a judge when 3 different experts would come up with different interpretations. But the thing about integration here is a lot of these things don't make sense. Like, this site is nowhere near an airport, so why would you have aviation or jet fuel? As my Uncle Bernie, who was a farmer, said, what farmer would have 90,000 liters or 20,000 gallons of tractor fuel? So there are things here that just don't make sense. But if you integrated all the information, you might alter your explanation. So we start off with a preliminary conceptual site model, which is like a phase 1. We look at existing records and we integrate that information. And then we go to a revised conceptual site model, which is like using a phase 2. We have some site-specific information, and you integrate that. And we'll talk about these a little more in a little bit. And then I like going to a robust conceptual site model where we add other tools and we put all the information together. And that gives us an explanation of the site that is pretty robust and difficult to dispute. I don't want to be wrong in my conceptual site models, because as an expert witness, you'll never get another job if you're shown that you're wrong. You have to bat pretty high. You can't bat like 220. So you have to get things right. So I like using what I call independent and complementary data to make my conceptual site model more robust. And in terms of independent data, I use data that answers the question directly, meaning, well, I'll show you an example, but from a totally different angle. And then complementary data constrains the answer but does not answer the question directly. So I'll show you an example of using independent and complementary data. So the question would be, how fast is groundwater moving? And we use Darcy's law, which the equation is given up there, and we'll talk about it in a couple of minutes, to figure out how fast the groundwater is moving. So if I wanted to use independent data, I could use something like tritium. Tritium is an environmental isotope which has been used for many decades to determine when groundwater recharge, and tritium is a remnant of the Cold War atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. Or you can use a conservative chemical like chloride. That gives me a way to evaluate velocity without actually using Darcy's law. Or I can constrain my groundwater velocity with complementary data. Like I could look at a geologic core like we see at the left in this photo, which will not allow groundwater to move very quickly. So I have to make those items match. And I want to check every time I add some information to the feedback to make sure my conceptual model still works, or I have to revise it. So I'm going to quickly go over common forensic methods. The first piece of information is like a site history. We do interviews and records, and it limits what is probable, what is not. What has the site been used for before? We have to look at the geologic framework because that controls the movement of chemicals. Seems like a lot of people here are interested in the geologic framework. And your geology can be complicated. On the left we see a fluvial geology with meandering stream deposits. On the right we see glacial geology, and you have to understand what the implications are of these types of geology. Or it can get really complicated. On the left we see a fractured clay, which is common in the Great Lakes area, or varved clays, which are in the middle, which are common in glacial lake areas, and fractured bedrock, which what would happen if you couldn't see those fractures, if you had 30 feet of soil on top of it. So it does really important in terms of the groundwater flow. And third piece is groundwater hydraulics. Generally, how fast does groundwater flow? and we use Darcy's law, as I mentioned, and 3 parameters: hydraulic conductivity, hydraulic gradient, and porosity. Hydraulic conductivity is the ability of material to transmit fluid, and here we can see one core, there's lots of different changes, and this is a parameter which varies over a large range. How do you measure it? There are all sorts of ways to measure hydraulic conductivity, and you have to use the appropriate method depending on the grain size. These are all lab methods here that we see on this slide. Or field methods. We have a slug test on the top left, pump test or aquifer test in the bottom, and we're using HPT, a hydraulic profile tool, on the top to look for permeable zones. So there's all sorts of methods to evaluate K. Porosity, we generally don't measure. It's the open space. The smaller the porosity, the higher the velocity. We usually assume these from tables. And fractures are very important, especially on low hydraulic conductivity materials like clay soils or rock. Hydraulic gradient is simply is the slope of a subsurface water body or the water table, or we can have a potentiometric surface of an aquifer. And we measure water levels, and it's important that this is done accurately. It's fairly easy to do, but also fairly easy to have mistakes in it. And we come up with a simple groundwater flow map. Shows us where the groundwater flows, and you can see the arrows, and where it does not flow. Groundwater flows perpendicular to the equal potential lines, or these blue lines. So groundwater would flow from, just let me do this. Groundwater would flow this way. It would not flow this way. It flows perpendicular to the groundwater contours, the blue lines. So what other kind of feedback can you get from this? Well, all things being equal, if the groundwater levels are steep, if the gradient is steep, you've got a lower hydraulic conductivity, and if it's like we see, I've got to get my pointer options. Where we've got the contours far apart, that means the materials has a higher hydraulic conductivity or permeability. What happens to groundwater flow if the geology is complicated? Like the meander bends, not only is it complicated in 2 dimensions, but it's a 3-dimensional issue that this model shows here, where you have complex distribution of low and high permeability materials. And again, what happens to groundwater flow in a fractured rock? It's very complicated. We need to understand the distribution of chemicals in the subsurface, and that's fairly easy to do, to put your arms around the extent of contamination. But fate and transport is another thing. It means what happens to the chemicals in the subsurface. And it's important to understand that releases become plumes, and how do they do that? And it's due to water moving through a porous media. The picture on the right is downtown Toronto simulating a porous medium, and you could take many different ways to get from point A to point B. And you've got big roads, small roads, and so on. But for low permeability materials, diffusion is important. That's what the cup of tea does. Cup of tea demonstrates that chemicals can move only by concentration gradients. And this is very important in low hydraulic conductivity materials like clays. So check your feedback, see if it still fits. Groundwater, whoops, go that way. Groundwater modeling was something when I was a student, I thought it was the end-all and be-all. It allows us to answer questions like who is responsible, when will the contamination reach wells, and so on. There's a definite process involved in modeling which you have to follow. You see on the left side, there's developed a conceptual site model. You model the conceptual site model, not the actual material. And these can be complex 3-dimensional models, or they can be simple models. You have all sorts of choices, flow or transport, meaning just you want to know groundwater, you don't want to know chemicals. Do you want one-dimensional, two-dimensional, or three-dimensional? Steady state means it doesn't change with time. Transient means it does. So you have to make decisions. You have to pick a model that is appropriate for the processes and conceptual site model you're demonstrating. Again, check the feedback. I've seen real horror stories on modeling, people who have abused models, and it comes out when you're in a court situation with forensic material. Use and abuse of fingerprinting. This is a technique that you'll commonly see in forensics investigations, where people will use a diagnostic trait to distinguish between releases. You can look at chemicals, groups of chemicals, chemical ratios, isotopes, and other things to try to identify where a release came from or who's responsible. For specific chemicals, an example, in Canada, lead was banned in 1990, so if you find lead in gasoline, generally, most often, it's a pre-1990 release. MTBE, which is methyl tert butyl ether, was it's an oxygenate additive to gasoline, which was used between 86 and 2003. So these will give you information as to when release had to occur. Or you can use groups of chemicals. These are chromatograms of different types of fuels. We see regular gasoline over here and fuel oil here and jet fuel. Oh, and jet fuel at the bottom right. Sorry, here's fuel oil and regular gasoline. And they have distinguishing traces in their fuel chromatograms. And this slide here shows the difference between fresh gasoline and, say, weathered gasoline, and you can see changes that occur as the fuels weather, the lighter fractions volatilize and disappear. Get my cursor here. Here's a way to use chemical ratios. B, T, E, and X represent benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, and these are chemicals that you get from gasoline releases generally. And if you look at the ratios, you can get an idea of the age, and this is from Kaplan et al. 1997, that if that ratio is 1.5 to 6, the release is 1 to 5 years old, and if it's less than 5, the release is greater than 10 years old. And, you know, this is a controversial method, but it is, I find that it's quite useful. We can use carbon isotopes and to identify sources of fuel. This is a figure that shows carbon 13 to carbon 12 ratios for fuels or crude from different parts of the globe. This isn't all that useful unless you've got fuels coming from all parts of the globe. You can use carbon and hydrogen isotopes. Here we've got the ratio of H2 to H1, hydrogen 2 to hydrogen 1 on the y-axis, and carbon 13 to carbon 12 on the x-axis. And weathering tends to release the lighter isotopes, leaving behind the heavier isotopes. So you could see a weathering process occurring in a release of gasoline, for example, or fuel oil. Here's an abuse of forensics, which I recently ran into. This on the left represents a plume with 3 samples. We've got the isotopic composition. This was defined as unweathered gasoline, but a catastrophic release because none of the samples showed more or less weathering. But really it's not, it was incomplete information, because if you had a sample further up gradient or down gradient, you could have large amounts of weathering showing. So you have to, again, integrate your information to come up with a robust conceptual model. This is a quote from Dr. Stout. Fingerprinting is a powerful forensic tool when it is applied properly. The utility and defensibility is enhanced when it's incorporated with other forensic tools. I would take that one step further. Use it, but use it with other tools. By itself, you can run into problems. Geophysics, finally, the last piece. It's using remote sensing, basically, uses physical properties as subsurface material. In this picture, we're seeing ground-penetrating radar, people looking for a buried tank. This one, they're using magnetics to look for a buried tank. But important part of geophysics is you need to ground truth. You need to confirm whatever you find, because it's not always infallible. Here's some soil vapor monitoring. This is at a gas station where we're using these little probes that we put a few inches below the surface to get a map of where the highest concentrations of chemicals from the release are, and that helps us to focus our investigation. So I'm going to quickly go through a few case studies. This one we saw before. This is a site that had TCE in the groundwater. They made aluminum tubing. In 1994, they were trying to sell this site. One consultant was looking at millions to remediate. The regulators were looking to sue because there was impact in the groundwater in this subdivision over here. And this is the conceptual site model that we came up with. It was actually the previous people had the groundwater flowing the wrong way. So in the end, we were able to avoid the lawsuit and avoid millions in remediation. By 2014, the site was decommissioned. There we had some strategic soil removal, 1 year of monitoring, and the site was closed with MFA. How far? Okay. I just moved back for those people who may have missed something. To the soil vapor mapping, we use these little devices to absorb vapors that are given off by impacted soil at a gas station, and we could focus where the release was. The first case study, I'm just going to start again, was it was an aluminum tube extraction operation. There was TCE in the groundwater. There was TCE in the groundwater in this subdivision that they used the groundwater. The model that the previous consultants were using was wrong. They had the groundwater flowing, contaminated groundwater, flowing into the subdivision when really it discharged before it got there. So we were able to save a lawsuit that the regulators were going to bring and millions of dollars in remediation. By 2014, the site had been decommissioned. We had to do some strategic soil removal, 1 year of groundwater monitoring. The site was closed with no further action. So getting the conceptual site model was worthwhile. This is a little more complex site. There was a 1,000-liter release of gasoline in 2006. The remediation progress was stalled. This was actually, the release was observed, so we knew exactly when it happened and where it happened. Later on in 2010, the regulator was saying that there was off-site contamination over here that had to be evaluated, delineated. There were vapors in a pumping station in a sewer, and the remediation had to continue. The original conceptual site model, I won't go into details, but the key here, this is the soil BTEX. So benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. The USTs were here, and you can see there are two distinct bodies of contamination with nothing in between. Same with the groundwater, but the groundwater we can see is flowing this way. There was a lake down here, which kind of made sense. However, what was wrong with the conceptual site model? Well, the aerial distribution of BTEX in soil, the gap in the middle was problematic. The amount that was released was about 740 kilograms or 1,500 pounds versus 3,000 kilograms that were observed in the soil. The depth of the impact was different on the east and west. The east and the west had different chemical ratios. The age, we could tell, the recent, basically the 2006 release was in the east but not in the west. And it turns out that there was actually, in the site history, there was a tank overlook on the west side. And the result, one other thing is we monitored groundwater continuously to see which way it flowed. And what happened was there was a lake over here controlled by a dam, sewers over here that were leaking. So there was a groundwater divide here that prevented chemicals from going from the USTs over to the west side. So we were able to get basically no further action by using a revised conceptual site model. And the regulators basically said, you know, if you'd only shown me one thing, I wouldn't believe it. But we showed them 7 reasons why that our client shouldn't have to do anything more. Here's one we talked about before, historical gas release, who was responsible. There was impacted soil, impacted groundwater, and free product on 2 adjacent properties, several potential sources. We went through kind of eliminating by using various forensic methods which ones could be used. We talked about the forensics issue, but in the end, the other side failed to integrate the hydrogeology, soil impact, site histories, geophysics. They didn't find any sources anywhere. And common sense, that was the big one. Nobody could quite buy that there was jet fuel or aviation fuel or 20,000 liters of tractor fuel that was released quickly. After a 3-week trial, the opposing attorney rhetorically asked, this is after I was on the stand for 2.5 days, how can you be so sure about everything? And basically I didn't answer, but I was thinking the picture we see here. And finally, this is a project we're working on currently. Cold War era TCE was used to clean bombers. It got into the soil and groundwater, and it is moving towards the city well field, a place in Kansas. We've started working on this in May, and we're trying to figure out the extent of the problem and eventually come up with a remedial approach. But it did go to mediation, our clients versus the U.S. government. The U.S. government wanted to clean up the soil and groundwater by primarily doing injections. And we were looking at a one-time injection of money for doing this remediation. And the geology is like we see in the picture on the right, very complex meandering stream geology. And in this case, it's mostly low permeability soils, which are not amenable to injection on a fixed budget. So we're still working on that, but it's very important to understand the hydrogeology, the distribution of chemicals, and fate and transport. And I'll stop there since I've gone slightly over. If you have any questions, hopefully you've emailed those to Alan, and I can answer those in the next few minutes. Otherwise, take note of the phone numbers and emails if you want to email questions, and thank you for listening.
Okay, Mike, can you hear me? This is Alan.
I can hear you.
Okay. I want to apologize to everyone. We had some phase-out issues during the presentation. Hopefully you guys got all the pertinent information. Obviously, if you didn't, please let us know. We do have a couple of questions, Mike. One of the questions was, what are the expertise of the other forensic experts that you typically would see, whether in court or remediation or whatever?
I've seen variety. In one case, where we were looking at permits for large-scale dairy, there was a person who was very focused on fractures in clay soils. On the cases where I've been involved in fuel releases, there have been people who are very focused on the fingerprinting. And sometimes you get kind of a balanced approach, but often you'll run into just arguments that are based on one technique, and sometimes that can be catastrophic for them.
Okay, thanks. We have another question. Dr. Splash, what are your thoughts or opinions on incorporating bioavailability of contaminants in risk assessments for contaminated soil and sediment sites?
That's actually something that I don't do, so I can't give you an opinion on that.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. We will encourage everyone, if you do have questions, please feel free to contact either Dr. Splash or myself on the emails listed on the screen in front of you, and we'll do our best to get back with you. We again appreciate everyone joining us today, and do apologize for some of the phase-out issues. Mike, any last words from you?
Just, in general, the more integration of various approaches you see with your problems, that the more likely you're going to get to that correct answer, which we will never know, but you'll get closer.
Okay, with that, I guess we'll wrap up this webinar. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us, and we will let you know when we have our next webinar. Thanks again.
I think I got everyone. 19 people.